In 2009, I was part of a team that jointly led it in an application in a British court for an arrest warrant for Zika Livni, Israel's foreign minister, for her part, and just bear in mind in relation to recent events, for her part in alleged war crimes which killed civilians during Operation Cast Lead in Gaza. Now, based on evidence that we collected and submitted to a court, it became clear to a British court what Israel was capable of doing 15 years ago in 2009. In 2009, Operation Cast Lead saw the killing of 1,400 Palestinians, including 300 children, with over 5,000 injured. I'm just going to read those numbers out. I'm going to explain to you why I'm going to read those numbers out again. 1,400 Palestinians died in Operation Cast Lead, including 300 children and over 5,000 people injured. People were so outraged by that level of death that there were UN reports written about it. We applied for an arrest warrant, and an arrest warrant was granted. In 2014, Israel killed 2,189 Palestinians, including 513 children, with over 11,000 injured. And again, people were outraged, the United Nations was outraged, people said this was terrible and shouldn't be able to happen again. But now, by October the 9th, 2024, Israel had made clear to the rest of the world what it was prepared to do now that it had suffered 1,200 casualties on its own soil. By June 2024, Israel has so far killed over 40,000 people, mostly women and children. It has destroyed the health infrastructure and starved the population of Gaza to the level of famine. People are literally dying of starvation at the behest of the Israeli government policy and military strategy. And it just... That I can use those words, right? That there is a state, an allied state, using the tool of starvation as a policy and military strategy. I mean, this is phenomenal. 2024, we're in. Just to make the point of where we are. But despite the positions governments have taken, people, ordinary people around the world remain resolute. In the United Kingdom, excuse me, in the United Kingdom, government policy, previous government policy, and somewhat current government policy, is at odds with public sentiment. Most people do not back Israel's war on Gaza. Most people back a ceasefire. Most people back the release of hostages. Most people, including those that are more sympathetic to Israel, and that's really interesting, most people, including those that are more sympathetic to Israel, think Israel should enter into peace negotiations with Hamas. And despite this, governments, especially in the West, have made themselves complicit in alleged war crimes. They have funded and provided political and diplomatic support to Israel. The UN Security Council has failed immeasurably to halt any acts that might plausibly prevent violations of international law. In fact, the Security Council has become a place not where states try to solve the world's problems, but where they try to embarrass each other through provocatively worded resolutions, all the while people continue to die. It took a global South country, South Africa, to trigger the Genocide Convention. We didn't do it. South Africa did it, to try to protect Palestinians from annihilation. The ICJ's provisional measures ruling was that Palestinians risk genocide at the hands of Israel. And that ruling, that provisional measures ruling, has been met with word games to diminish its significance by organizations in the United Kingdom, as well as lobbyists, as well as advisors to government in the United Kingdom, as well as abroad. It has resulted in no meaningful action by the Security Council to support its ruling. The ICC chief prosecutor, as we know, has now issued arrest warrant applications for the arrest of 5 individuals in relation to the situation in Gaza. The US and Israel, instead of respecting the ICC mandate, have worked to undermine it. A British organisation has referred the prosecutor to the Bar Council because he's a British barrister. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And that hasn't been condemned by our government, and it should be condemned by our government. The US has threatened the ICC's officers and their families with actions simply for the ICC working to its mandate. In the last days of the dying Tory government, British Foreign Office lawyers would dispatch the ICC to disgracefully argue for jurisdictional immunity for suspected Israeli war criminals, but not the same for Palestinians. And I am thankful to the current government for withdrawing that objection. Nonetheless, the arrest warrant applications and South Africa's case at the ICC are historic moments in our human history. The current proceedings at the UN, ICJ and ICC demonstrate an inherent weakness in the structural protections we have when rights under international humanitarian law are violated. We do not have independent and objectively operating institutions to put into place any practical protections for people when their rights are being violated, even when the allegation is genocide. You know, it's woeful that nearly 80 years after the end of World War II, which saw the annihilation of 6 million Jews, 6 million Jews, and just wait for the next number, and a death toll of around 75 million human beings, we still, as the human race, cannot understand the cost of war and have no effective mechanism to prevent vast war and genocide. Now, I remember the first time I saw that number, I thought my computer screen had an error on it. 75 million human beings we wasted. For what? There is little personal cost to perpetrators for violating international law. On the contrary, my experience is that the risk-benefit calculation is heavily weighted in favour of committing war crimes for financial, political and personal gain. The failure of the international institutions to bring any kind of resolution to the killing in Gaza and in other places across the globe have left me with an understanding that our institutions are broken and abused by the powerful who wield them in their own interests. The mantra of protecting human beings has itself become weaponized to further the interests of the wealthy and powerful against the weak. As I said, I do not trust our governments or the institutions that they control to protect ordinary people like me and you from famine, devastation, or war crimes. Those politicians that have aided and abetted or supported the perpetration of war crimes by either providing political cover, encouraging it, or supplying weapons or military material to war criminals are themselves war criminals. The UK and US, along with others, continue to support and supply weapons and finance to Israel, rendering the decision makers personally liable to the accusation of complicity in war crimes. My experience with the Livnia restaurant led me to understand that the state, particularly our state, could not be relied to uphold the rule of international law. After the warrant was granted, British politicians worked to ensure impunity by changing primary legislation to allow political interference in legal proceedings and thereby protecting war criminals not just from Israel but from across the globe. Had that not happened, and Zippy Livni had seen the inside of a British court, just imagine the strength and deterrent impact of international law that may have prevented what we're seeing now in the Ukraine and Gaza. After this event, we decided that we could not rely on the political class nor the institutions they control to protect ordinary civilians from war crimes and international law violations. It's for that reason that we established the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians, where I'm a director. At the ICJP, we work with the infrastructure behind the war and behind the killing in order to primarily try to prevent it, but in reality, often because we can't prevent it, hold those that are guilty of war crimes accountable for their part in it. We intend to make the cost personal for those perpetrating or complicit in war crimes in a way that at present states and their institutions just simply do not do. Some of the members of the previous Conservative government in the UK that we suspected of complicity may no longer actually hold political office, but they do continue to carry the liability of the actions that they carried out in government, and we intend to continue to pursue them. And some of you may know that we've lodged a complaint with Scotland Yard in respect of 5 British former ministers who we say are complicit in Israeli war crimes in Gaza. Now, after the 7th of October, we saw Israel set on a course of collective punishment against all Palestinians. But not only that, we also saw politicians around the world were set on supporting Israeli military action without restraint, no matter what it was going to be. Within the first week, ICJP wrote in private to politicians to warn them of their potential complicity, but they ignored us. And so we started a worldwide legal movement. We publicly put politicians personally on notice that this time we would hold them accountable in their own state for supporting Israeli war crimes. And within the same day, politicians started to heed Israel to comply with international law. We at the ICJP pledged to make sure politicians complicit in war crimes are held to account in our courts. Seeing the massive rise in civilian deaths and the ruthless targeting of schools, hospitals and the civilian infrastructure, we launched what we call our Justice for Gaza campaign to secure and record evidence of war crimes to a standard that can be used in international and domestic legal proceedings. We are currently engaged in the painstaking exercise of evidentially recording every single action taken by Israel in Gaza for for use in criminal prosecutions. So far, that evidence has been taken by Scotland Yard, the International Criminal Court, and the South African legal team at the ICJ, as well as legal teams for use in domestic legal proceedings, such as the Al-Haq judicial review against weapons. In the UK, we have already lodged a complaint, as I said, with Scotland Yard based on the UK's incorporation of the Rome Statute in the International Criminal Court and in the International Criminal Courts Act in relation to former British ministers. Now, none of these ministers are ministers anymore. They're just regular citizens, and we have made the determination to maintain our focus on them. If the police fail us and decide not to pursue an investigation with regards to them, we will refer the police, the Attorney General, the British government, as well as those individuals to the ICC for failing to comply with their own statute and carry out an effective investigation. The only thing that will stop a prosecution at the ICC is a principle called complementarity, in that the domestic processes have been carried out sufficiently. And if they don't pursue our evidence and these ministers, we will consider that to be a failure in that process. We recently expanded our complaint to include the offence of starvation, and our suspect list to include former Israeli spokespersons, and we say are complicit in the crime of starvation. We have the intention to ensure that our evidence and our complaints are used by every state-level prosecution agency in every country in the world until we have accountability for what is happening in Gaza. We have pledged support to support legal groups to replicate this work in the across the globe. In addition to our legal work prosecuting Israeli and British war criminals, as I mentioned a moment ago, we've supported the Al-Haq and Glan's judicial review against issuing weapons licenses to Israel, with a full hearing imminently due in October. We put pressure on the previous government and the current government to refund UNRWA by issuing pre-action protocol procedures against them, and as you know, the Labour government has decided to refund UNRWA. We have been successful in protecting people being attacked by pro-Israeli activists following vexatious complaints to the police, workplaces, professional regulators such as the GMC or Charity Commission. I noted in my last meeting, there were specific people waiting for me to make a mistake so that they could make a complaint, or to hold me accountable for it, or to write some nonsense newspaper article. We're used to this, it happens all the time. Bring it on. We will continue to take direct legal action to prevent Israel being able to carry out its ambition of collectively punishing Palestinians and carrying out plausibly genocidal acts in Gaza, Jerusalem and the West Bank. Our legal work has resonated around the globe, and we have briefed representatives of over 30 countries from across the world, from heads of state to foreign ministers and ambassadors. Our single message is that this time, we must use international law to hold Israel accountable for its alleged war crimes. We cannot allow international law to be ignored or abused. Israel can no longer be gifted impunity. The recipe for peace is not difficult. It is the political will for peace that's missing. The cure is a rules-based accountability structure which applies equally to Palestinians and Israelis, recognition of the state of Palestine, and equality before the law for Palestinians and Israelis. Without this formula, there can be no basis for peace. If you remove accountability through the law, you leave violence as the only option that people have. Our human history has shown us what happens when violence is the only answer. If our governments have forgotten that the pain that led to the creation of international law and the necessity of accountability, we must stand in their places in every workplace, in every institution, and every court to do their work in spite of them. Thank you very much.